Hello and welcome to our webinar, Assessments Matter, Transform RTI at Your School. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dave Kivra, Regional Director of Development for Lindenwood Bell for Schools. Mr. Kivra has worked in education for 20 years, including more than 15 years with Lindenwood Bell. He's been involved in professional development in over 30 states and 9 countries. Mr. Kivra holds a Master's in Education Policy and Planning from George Washington University. Among other projects, he's provided a program evaluation to the Office of the State Superintendent of Education of a $2.5 million Race to the Top grant, and designed and implemented a research study on the role of principals in the implementation of response to intervention reading programs in urban school district. Mr. Kivra is a strong believer in public education and the proud father of 3 boys under age 8, the oldest 2 of whom are enrolled in DC public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dave Kivra.
Great, thanks Mike. Appreciate the introduction. And thanks to everybody out there for taking time out of your busy day to join with us. As Mike said, my name is Dave, and I'm going to kind of walk us through this discussion about response to intervention and assessments. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why we kind of decided we wanted to have this webinar. And really it draws on the experiences that we've, myself and my colleagues have had when we've been working out in the field, getting into groups and going into classrooms and working with teachers who've been trained in the programs and trying to help them really figure out how best to work with their students. And a little over a month ago, I was down in Georgia working with a teacher who'd been through a Seeing Stars workshop. Seeing Stars is the program that we do for students who are struggling with decoding. And it had taken her a couple of weeks to get her groups together, but I came to visit. She had a group of about 5 fourth graders sitting in front of her. And she had her kit out to the side, and she was, she had all the parts of it there, and she was trying to figure out what was the language that she should be using, how was she supposed to remember how to use these parts, what was the process she's supposed to go through, and how does she handle her students' mistakes. So I kind of jumped in and I started modeling some of the steps with the students. And it took just a couple of minutes, but I pretty quickly realized that amongst this group of 5 fourth graders, I had 3 very distinct groups. So I had a group of students off to my right who could work pretty well at about 4 sounds, a little bit into 5 sounds, and pretty soon I could tell they could be ready to go on into multisyllable work. And then I had a group of 2 students right in front of me who really just down at 2 sounds were super unstable in terms of just their short vowel sounds, right? And then to my left, I had a young girl who really just had real difficulty understanding the relationship between sounds and letters, that letters were going to cause sounds. And so I thought about the real challenge that teacher faces, right? She's there, she's trying to do her best. She's gotten her group of students, she's got her kit out, she's well-intentioned, she's motivated. And she's just facing too large a range of students within that one group to effectively differentiate instruction with them, to learn the program, and to help those students eventually learn how to read, right? And it just wasn't an effective group for her. And we all know that within response to intervention, we're supposed to be differentiating instruction, right? But that relies on us being able to understand the differences between our students. So if you really think about it, differentiated instruction relies on having a differential diagnosis, right? And that's where our instruction really needs to start from. So if we jump on into the PowerPoint, I'm going to walk us through a little bit of these parts. There we go. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about how we use assessments and how we can think about assessments as accomplishing a couple of different goals for us. So we can think about assessments as, we'll get to that in a second. We'll talk a little bit more in depth once we've got assessments about differences in students. We'll spend a bunch of time talking about how we determine those differences, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to remediate. So big picture, in terms of what do we use assessments for? We can use assessments to kind of measure growth for students. So we can use, we can compare our students to the quote-unquote average student to see how it is that they are progressing. We can measure growth year over year, and we can also measure growth from the beginning of an intervention to the end of an intervention. We can also use assessments to help us try to figure out what intervention program we want to do with students. And then once we've figured out what intervention program we want, we can also use assessments to try to differentiate the instruction that we're doing there. In other words, figure out the best group that we can use with our students, or the best way that we can organize our students into groups. So if you kind of think about these three different lines here, you can think about how they are in increasing precision, right? The first is to kind of measure growth overall. The second is if our students not getting the growth that we want them to, what intervention program can we do with them? Once we've determined an intervention program, even more refined, how can we begin to differentiate instruction for them? So we'll start really big picture, and then we're going to begin to get a little bit finer. So in terms of a big picture, you can think about students who are struggling with reading comprehension as existing across an entire language processing spectrum. It kind of ranges from students who are struggling with decoding words at one end to students who are struggling with comprehending written or oral language at the other end. And of course, you're going to have students sprinkled throughout this spectrum. But if we think about what happens often at Tier 1, if we're using sort of a reading comprehension measure to assess our students, a student who's struggling with decoding is not going to do well on answering the reading comprehension questions, right? But they're not going to do well because they can't decode, they can't literally pull the words off the page, right? So they're supposed to be able to sound out words, but they have a deficit in terms of their word attack, so they can't really get those words sounded out. They're supposed to be able to recognize sight words, but they can't recognize those sight words. Maybe they read just really choppily, a single word at a time. So by the time they get to the end of the paragraph, it's been several minutes, and they've lost what it was that the content included. And so that's why it is that they're scoring very poorly on a reading comprehension measure. You can think about students who are like this as being kids who look at a word like stream and they say steam, right? And they can't recognize that they made a mistake, or even if they do recognize that they made a mistake, they don't know how to go about fixing that mistake, right? And obviously if they're misreading stream as steam, that's going to change their understanding of the content of that paragraph. Hence, they don't do well on a reading comprehension measure. Now, for many of these kids, if you just read the paragraph to them, they might end up doing just fine. But if they've got to read it themselves, they really struggle. So if we go back to so that's sort of one group of students down at that decoding end. If we flip and we think about students at the other end, at that comprehension end, this might be a student who sits down with that same passage of text, reads through it very quickly and fluently, gets to the end of it and still can't answer the questions, right? So these would be types of kids who are just getting bits and pieces from language. It's coming in one ear and going out the other. And I kind of think, when I think back to that group in Georgia, they were all working on decoding. It was the Seeing Stars program that they were working on, but that young girl to my left, really I could tell the challenge for her was that language, oral language as it's coming in, isn't making sense to her, much less what she's trying to read off of the page, right? So we've got our language processing spectrum, and it kind of ranges from those students who are struggling with decoding to those students who are struggling with language comprehension. And as we discussed, the challenge is, can we say that both of these students struggle with reading, right? And I can't see you all out there, but I can picture that you're probably nodding your head and saying, yep, they definitely struggle with reading. And those of you who are seeing students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 might say, yeah, both of those students might end up in my same intervention group. And the next question then that begs is, do they struggle in the same way, right? And obviously they don't struggle in the same way, right? So we probably wouldn't want to have them in the same intervention program. And if we end up with those kids, as we did in Georgia in the same intervention program, we're not going to have as much success as we potentially could, right? So that's reading in terms of sort of a big picture, thinking about it as students who struggle with decoding and students who struggle with comprehension. But really we want to dig a little bit finer. And I think when you start to think about assessments, what you want to think about is, am I assessing for all of the necessary component parts of reading, right? And there are a couple of those, so we're gonna run through those really quickly. Students, obviously, as we mentioned, have to be good in terms of their word attack. They've got to be able to look at a word that they're not familiar with and sound it out, right? They also, though, have to have really good word recognition. So if they sound out a word in one paragraph, they've got to be able to recognize that word again in the next paragraph. There's also all kinds of words that don't play phonetically fair that our students have to recognize right away. And then when you and I read, our students have to have a really good, well-developed vocabulary, right? You and I read, we generally don't sound out words. We're not waiting to recognize an entire word. Instead, we're using contextual cues to help us predict what the next word is going to be, and that helps us read very quickly and fluently. And all of these parts of reading fit into the overall whole of reading, which is comprehension, right? The whole point of reading. And ultimately, the only reason we're concerned about how a student's word attack or word recognition is, or how their vocabulary is because a weakness in any one of those areas causes a weakness in terms of language comprehension. So, when we look at assessments, we want to think about testing for each of those different skills that we just talked about. And we're going to come back to those reading circles again in a minute, but there are all those different parts, right? And we'll talk about Linda Bell's assessment battery that we use, but I think that you want to think about those circles and this list here and say to yourself, am I using an assessment battery that hits on each of these parts? Are there assessments within my school that I could pull to start to hit those different parts, or do we need to go out elsewhere and get some assessments? And again, the risk if we don't do that is that we end up with something like what you all see on the screen in front of you now, right? So this is a potential group that you might have in which all of those students, as you can see on the bottom line, have got a weakness in terms of their reading comprehension. But they all have that weakness because of different factors, right? None of them are the same that you're sitting there and sort of working with. And I go back to thinking about that group in Georgia and the teacher that I was working with. At the end of that group, she kind of, we released the students and let them go. And I said to her, wow, you did a great job. Felt like that was a really tough group, like, a wide spectrum of students that you're working with here. And she said, oh, it's such a relief that you're saying that because I felt the same way. And I said, okay, great. Well, what did you use to help you group these students? What assessments did you use so that you were figuring out that this was the right mix of kids that you wanted? And she said, well, I didn't use any assessments. Their IEPs said that they all needed this, and so that's how I created my group. And obviously, that causes a real challenge, right? Because she can't differentiate her instruction, she can't learn the program effectively, and the time that she gets with those kids isn't going to be as well utilized as it could be. Okay? So think about reading as involved with 3 different sensory cognitive functions, right? Students have got to be very adept in terms of their phonemic awareness, or their ability to locate the identity, number, and sequence of sounds within words. They've also, though, got to have really good symbol imagery. And you can think about symbol imagery as your ability to picture letters in your mind so that you can recognize words very quickly and so that you can do phonemic awareness exercises in relation to the actual letters and not just sounds. And then concept imagery. And concept imagery being, you can think about that as the ability to kind of create a movie in your mind as you're reading a book or listening to somebody tell you about something, right? And so our assessment should tell us which of those different sensory cognitive functions are weak for our students so that we can then choose an intervention program that is focused on those different weaknesses, right? So in terms of going back to our reading circles and thinking about assessments for them, right? Again, at Linda Bell, we've got an assessment battery that we use. They're all nationally, publicly available, nationally normed assessments that we use, right? So you could certainly get them yourself, but you might be using some assessments, that you've got there in the building, right? We use a test called, for word attack, we use a test called the Woodcock-Johnson word attack subtest, right? And again, there are a whole bunch of different word attack assessments that you might try to use. In terms of looking at word recognition, we use a test called the Wide Range Achievement Test. Some folks use the Slauson Oral Reading Test. There are a bunch of different sight word assessments that you might use, right? So I'll draw our little arrow to make sure we know what circle we're going to. And to check on our students' vocabulary, just their basic single word receptive vocabulary, we use something called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. Right? And that gives us a good sense of where their vocabulary is. And then, of course, we also want to try to figure out how is their fluency, and how was their language comprehension. And so to assess that, we use a test called the Gray Oral Reading Test, right? And what we're hoping to do from these assessments is really focus in on exactly where is the student literally telling us through this that their weaknesses are. Because that's where we need to respond, and we need to teach to their weakness and not teach toward the student's strength. Right? So once we've kind of figured out, all right, I think I've found which circles my students have a weakness in, I can then start to group my students more effectively. Once I've grouped them, I can then say, okay, now I can pick out my intervention program. And at Lindenwood Bell, we do 5 different programs, but we really focus in on 2 main ones. And those are Seeing Stars, which is our program for students who are struggling with decoding, and Visualizing and Verbalizing, which is our program that focuses on students who have a weakness in concept imagery or language comprehension, right? And those are the 2 programs that we'd kind of group our students into within a school, and then we've got to try to figure out how are we going to implement these programs within a school, right? And so that's when we get to this, fairly big slide, and I'm going to talk about it for a couple of minutes. When we go in and we work with schools, we really encourage, oftentimes Lindenwood Bell is thought about as being a program for students who are in special education or students who are really struggling with learning how to read, and that's certainly appropriate, right? But what we encourage schools to think about is to say, if we know that those sensory cognitive functions, symbol imagery, phonemic awareness, concept imagery, are necessary for students to be a complete reader, then rather than assuming that they develop, why don't we take some time out of our core instructional period to say, let's do some standalone process-based instruction for 15 to 20 minutes of Seeing Stars and 15 to 20 minutes of Visualizing and Verbalizing. And that helps us in a couple different ways, right? One of the ways that it helps is at K-1-2, there often aren't very many sophisticated assessments about how students are doing, particularly in terms of language comprehension, right? So those of you who are familiar with the programs can imagine if you sat down and you did 15 minutes of VV with a whole class of 25 kindergarten students, very quickly you're going to have an understanding of who can do this well and who can't. And that's going to help then inform your sort of tier 2 groups, right? Helps you start to figure out, hey, I can start to run some stations, I can get these students into some different groups. As students go into tier 2, you're either using a little bit of an intervention program or you're modifying your core instruction. Students continue to not be successful in that tier 2 setting. That's the point at which you want to move to tier 3. And that whole reading circles and all of those component parts of it, that's the point at which you really want to be doing that full comprehensive assessment of students, because you're going to start to pull them out at that point. And if we're going to pull kids out of the classroom, we need to make sure we know why we're pulling them out, what we're going to do with them, how we're going to measure it, and how we're going to group them. Because when we start to pull them out, that's when we can start to do some of that really intensive 5 days a week, 60 to 120 minutes a day of instruction with students, because that's what their weaknesses are telling us that they're going to need, right? So you can think about how that all fits into that triangle and kind of flows together. Another part that I wanted to talk about and why we push folks for a comprehensive set of implementation is to think about how often we have a lack of alignment that occurs within schools and within districts, right? So folks are doing instruction down here at tier 1. Students aren't being successful with it. They get to tier 3. Tier 1's teacher is often kind of frustrated because she's like, my kids are getting pulled out of class to go do something I don't know anything about. And the tier 3 instructor is frustrated because they're making great gains with their students. Their students are working this way back down here, but as they work their way down, none of that consistent language is being used in any of those other settings, right? So if you have sort of a comprehensive implementation of the program steps, then across this entire triangle, you have a common understanding of what is happening with kids as they're struggling to learn how to read. And a common understanding within that district and within that building about what we're going to do about it. And that really allows you to be much more flexible, right, in terms of what's happening with your tiers, because, RTI is supposed to be relatively fluid. Students are supposed to move from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 and then back down again, tier 1 to 2, back to 1. And that fluidity often doesn't really happen. Instead, students just move in one direction toward tier 3 and they don't come back the other way. And I think that part of that is that lack of alignment that we have and that lack of understanding that we have within schools about what's happening when students are struggling with learning how to read. So wow, that time went really fast. And I hope you all got some really good information out of that. If that went too quickly and you've got some additional questions that I'm not able to answer in a minute, definitely reach out to us. Love to get on the phone or interact with you by email and help answer some of those questions. But in the meantime, what I wanted to do was, go ahead into the question and answer section.
Now we'd like to take about 10 minutes to answer some of your questions. We may not have time to address all of your questions on the air, but our instructional experts will respond to everyone through the Q&A feature. Our first question: what if I have a student who has both a decoding and a comprehension weakness? Do I work on both at the same time?
So not an easy answer to this. And the temptation is to say, I'm going to address both, right? Unfortunately, what we've seen is that if you try to address both of those issues at the same time, they're different brain functions, right? As we hopefully I pressed that home through the discussion, but those are different brain functions, so you're not likely to remediate both of them at the same time and be successful. I think your better option is to choose one of them. Say, I'm either going to focus on decoding or I'm going to focus on language comprehension and work on that one until I've gotten my student to a relative degree of stability and then start to focus on the other challenge, right? And I think as you all are sitting out there and trying to think about your students, you've probably already picked out some kids who you know who have both of those weaknesses and you're like, what do I do? Make it easy on yourself and choose one focus. Oftentimes, folks start with decoding first. There are a couple different reasons for that, but one is that I think you're likely to see very rapid changes in terms of students' ability to decode words from one week to the next. This week they can't read cat, next week they can read the word cat. That helps motivate them to continue to go into small group. It helps motivate the teacher. Everybody starts to see some changes happening. School moves from being something that often is very frustrating and a place that kids don't want to go to into something that students feel successful and happy about. So we often kind of head in that direction. It's harder to recognize very quickly changes in terms of students' concept imagery.
Our next question is, do I have to do the full battery for my Tier 2 students?
All right, another good question. So hopefully, and I apologize if I didn't make it clear as we went through, and potentially I didn't, so appreciate the question. That full comprehensive assessment that I talked about, you don't want to be doing until students are moving from Tier 2 into Tier 3. Okay? I do think as students go from Tier 1 into Tier 2, you need to be doing some sort of assessment so that you're not seeing in your Tier 2 group students from either end of that spectrum put together, right? So that would be kind of like the Georgia situation I was talking about. All of those kids struggled with reading, but I don't think if I'm remediating, I really want to have that young girl and the other students in that same Tier 2 group because I think they've got very different challenges. So if I can begin to notice that early on, that's going to benefit me in Tier 2, but for sure, by the time I get to Tier 3, that's when I need to be doing that much more comprehensive assessment battery.
Here's another question. There's no way my school can do Tier 3 instruction the way you've described it. How do other schools do it?
No way they can do it. Okay, so I guess that can be two different ways. In terms of intensity of instruction or amount of time. And so when we had the triangle up there, and I can't go back to it right now, but when we had the triangle up there, we're talking about for Tier 3, we're trying to get 80 to 120 hours of instruction with our students when we're doing intervention with them. And So the question is, if you work your way backwards, how do I get 80 to 120 hours of instruction with a kid, depending on all the things that are going on in the school? Well, I do it by doing intensive instruction for 60 to 120 minutes a day. And I think the challenge comes out in a couple different ways. So I'm trying to walk my way back, and I'll make my way through it again. If you're a teacher and you're confronted with that situation, so you don't have that type of time, but the expectation is that you're doing intervention with your students, I really encourage you, and I encourage all teachers doing intervention, to track how much time you're actually getting with your students. Because that's going to allow you to say, okay, Linda Mood Bell said I likely need 80 to 120 hours with my students if they're this far behind. Let me track how much time I'm getting so I can say at the end of the year, here's how much time I actually got, right? Because that's going to let me know, did this intervention program work or not? Do we need to switch intervention programs because we did get enough time but it didn't work? Or did we not actually get enough time to measure it? It's also going to take some of the pressure off you, right? Because as a teacher, the expectation's on you. We're giving you these kids, we expect changes for them. Well, if I can't get the same amount of instructional time that they're saying I should get, then it's an unreasonable expectation on me. If you're an administrator, I think you want to kind of step back and say, okay, this is what they're saying these students need in terms of instruction. What can I change about, what can I structurally change about what we're doing to get them that type of intervention? And I'd say, that's not an easy discussion, but it does happen, right? It has worked in many, many districts in which we've implemented it. So you can carve out that time. I think part of what you want to think about is, often this becomes an issue of not wanting to pull students out of their Tier 1 instruction because the students are no longer present, right? They're no longer receiving the content at third grade or fourth grade. I'd kind of flip that on its head and say that the student, just because they're sitting there in the classroom, they're actually not receiving the content anymore, right? If they can't read a math word problem, then they can't access the content. And if they're like that young girl and language is coming in one ear and going out the other, we can talk about content all day long, but she can't access that content material. And so we've got to pull her out and say, okay, love to have her in class, but that's not working for us. So we need to pull her out and get her the instruction time necessary to make those parts of the brain work so that we can put her back into the class and help get her back up to speed with the content material. So that's kind of how I would frame a response to that. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded and go all over the place a little bit. But Mike, let's keep going.
Here's another one, Dave. What if we don't have time to do the full battery for my Tier 3 students?
Another good question. So I think in terms of the battery that we give, we've gotten it down to the point where we can, generally speaking, it is an assessment that's given one-on-one, but it can generally be given in about an hour's time with a student. So think about the number of students that you've got at risk and see if that's a possible carve-out for you. Because ultimately you're going to need to do a very comprehensive assessment at Tier 3. I don't know how you get around that. Because the danger is that if you don't, you're going to get students into a small group, and if it's not grouped effectively, your instruction isn't going to be as refined as it could, which means you're not going to make the gains that you make. So say you get the 80 to 120 hours, but it's a really frustrating, slow 80 to 120 hours because my students weren't grouped appropriately. I think you'd be better served by carving out some of that time and applying it to those assessments at the beginning so you at least know what it is that we're dealing with. What is the challenge that's in front of us? Then dive into your small groups, and then at the end of that year assess and say, okay, well, we still didn't get the instructional time. What do we need to change about it? But if there was a magic bullet, there was just one assessment that you could give that would tell us all of that, I'd love to have access to it because I think it would be tremendous for schools to be able to do that and discover that very quickly. Unfortunately, with those different cognitive functions all working together to be a complete reader, you're not likely to find an assessment, a single assessment that's like that you can deliver very quickly. How about another one, Mike?
Our last question of the day, do the programs take the place of a core curriculum?
I think the way that you can think about these programs, and maybe I didn't talk about this enough either during that RTI triangle, but really another benefit of having teachers do Seeing Stars or visualizing and verbalizing for 20 minutes with their whole classroom is that you can imagine they're then going to use that same language and those same processes throughout the day. So questioning to what students are picturing for language as it's coming in, that's language that you can use throughout. And you can use it in math and science and history all through the rest of the day. So rather than thinking about it replacing anything, I would think about how can I interweave this language into all of the different teaching that I'm doing, because this is really, it's about effective instruction, and these are very effective instructional methods that I think all good teachers want to be using. And that standalone time gives them time to practice the steps and practice the language. And the more that they practice it, the more they're going to use it throughout the rest of their day. So it looks like that's pretty much it. I'm going to turn it back over to Mike. Thank you all for joining with me. I definitely look forward to hopefully seeing some questions come across for me as well, in addition to those I already answered. And I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Dave. That was great. That's all the time we have for now. If you have further questions or would like to continue the conversation, please call us at 800-233-1819. That's 800-233-1819. Thank you for joining our webinar, and have a great day.